I've talked before about Russian use of battle scooters, which is that Russia has gone to go-karts because they didn't have enough BMPs and other armored vehicles, and then they went from go-karts to motorcycles, and now they've gone from motorcycles to electric scooters that you use on your college campus to go get a coffee. Here are Russians using them out in the field in Ukraine. Look at this. And look, I mean, I've fallen off those things before, just going around college campuses and such. You hit a stick, you hit a little pothole. Oh my gosh, could you imagine hitting a mine with this thing? Assault scooters, battle scooters. The second most powerful army in the world. That's what we were supposed to believe. My goodness. Not to downplay, of course, the threat of Russian advance, but when you've got a manpower abundance, but an equipment problem, this is what you get. Anyway, moving on, I just wanted to show you guys this because I've talked about it before, but we've never shown footage of it to prove its existence. What else we got on Ukraine? I've got a few more things on Ukraine, don't I? Yes. So we were talking about this earlier with Mercado Media, but it has to do with the fact that Russia right now, while pushing in Pokrovsk, and they were able to gain 6 kilometers in a week last week, something that is of course concern to the units on the ground, as Ukrainian units are overstretched, exhausted, and in some instances even poorly led. When we're talking about the Pokrovsk area, with the Russians looking for the units that are the most exhausted, the least trained, and the most poorly led, and attacking those in the front or waiting for rotations. But the Russians are still, in order to advance at this pace, having to take many, many casualties, having troops dismount 5 kilometers from the position, have 200, 300 troops charge up to a village with 30 guys in it, and then they get bombed the whole way there. They lose 1/3 of those troops. That's 100 dead guys. They still take the village. Congratulations, you've taken the village, but you still have to lose 100 dead guys there, 150 there, 200 there, and that builds up over time. And so in order to sustain these operations, not just in Pokrovsk, which is where 50% of the clashes are happening, but also still on the Volchansk axis, so they don't get pushed out of the city, which the Ukrainians are still trying to do, or around Lipsy, or if we're talking about Chasiv Yar, where the Russians are still trying to push, or even down south on the Zaporizhia axis. They're trying to add pressure there so the Ukrainians can't redeploy troops. So their reserves are tied up. In order to keep this pressure means that the Russians have been losing a lot of troops, because they have to dedicate a lot of troops to keep this offensive going, to keep the pressure on the Ukrainians. And there's always the risk of punching yourself out, burning out your reserves, and then the Russians finding the tables turned on them. And so they have to be careful of that. And the Russians are having some warning signs from military bloggers and Russian soldiers and pilots reporting about the cannibalization of units who are specialized to do one thing for the Russian armed forces, but then are made to perform infantry attacks, to form infantry assault groups and to form into infantry due to the high losses. Here's one example translated by War Translated. It's the VKS Motorized Rifle Regiment week. Don't pay attention to the video and content. You need to pay attention to the splash screen. Motorized Rifle Regiment of the Aerospace Forces. People recruited from airfields. There are engineering and technical staff, flight crews, and flight crews present. Armed forces, radio operators, mechanics, engine and brake engineers, sergeants, warrant officers, and officers. It seems there is even one navigator. They fight normally, as everybody. Everything is provided, no complaints, everything is fine. This is approximately the same as the Motorized Rifle Regiment of Alexei Chor. Well, or a CSKA football team assault brigade. There must be a message or conclusion here, but it is not there. Today, this is a given. And then points to the video of, and you don't need to listen to the music, but this is the Russian Air Force, members of the Russian Air Force that are now doing drone attacks and fighting on the front in infantry positions in roles they were not trained for, that they do not specialize in, as they're trying to fulfill the role to have enough drone pilots, soldiers, and infantry on the front to keep up the pressure on Ukrainian positions. Here are them serving in infantry tasks. doing infantry roles right here, training. Point is that they're cannibalizing people that should be performing their tasks, what they were trained in, but are instead performing infantry roles because they don't have enough men. And this is not the only instance of it. There was a reaction to this post by a different mobilized blogger who added that Russian units were repurposing other personnel with soldiers that were, like we were discussing, assigned from different roles. Oh, I was a mortar crewman. Oh, but we don't have enough mortars now, so now you're doing infantry. Oh, we were doing this. Oh, we don't have enough of this now, so now you're doing this. And was criticizing the positional offensive strategy of like doing wave after wave after wave to take these tiny villages in order to get into good positions against bigger cities due to the high casualties and how quickly it drives up the reserves that Russia pays a lot and recruits a lot of people in order to build up that they don't have, even though Russia is the largest country on the planet and has a large population, endless amounts of, certainly as they have a population crisis. Anyway, let's read a little bit about this. I don't know if we're going to read the whole thing, but let's read a little bit about it. Fighter Bomber posted about the VKS Motorized Rifle Regiment. At the end, he writes that there must be some conclusion, but he does not voice it. I'll try to voice it. This is a tricky one. Under the slogan, as long as there is not a second wave of mobilization, various types of units are being scooping up contracts for personnel for replenishment or the formation of new detachments or even units, as we see from the report. So what he's talking about is the first wave of mobilization Russia did was the only time Putin clearly, from Levada polling and from other polls, even though acknowledging all the issues with trying to do any polling in Russia, that we know for sure Putin took a popularity hit because he took a population that was either apathetic about the war or passively supportive and was telling them that they had to go fight and die or they had to send their family to go fight and die. And that is not something that somebody who is either apathetically supportive or is apathetic about the whole war in general is going to want to be put in. And that leads to a popularity hit, especially if Russia is also suffering economically due to the war and there's no end in sight. And the longer this war goes on, the potentially more dangerous a second wave of mobilization would be, even if it would be necessary for Russia to achieve any of its goals of capturing cities like, for example, Kramatorsk, or for capturing Slovansk, or for example, going back over the Dnieper River to take Kherson. In addition, there are situational initiatives. So that's why the government is very hesitant to engage in another wave of mobilization. In addition, there are situational initiatives. Before this video, I heard that the Navy, as soon as possible, transfers contract soldiers to Marine brigades, including transferring of the commander's platoon into an assault platoon. Now here is a motorized rifle regiment consisting of the VKS personnel. In addition, there are situational initiatives at the front. For example, taking at least a few unnecessary signalmen to replenish the assault company, transferring RMO officers to the UAV platoon being formed because contractors or specialists for mobilization have not appeared, form an evacuation group from a mortar battery after the loss of material, disband the sniper platoon of a sniper company in order to transfer the personnel to an assault platoon. Snipers trained to be in secret, hidden, out far away from the position, being given rifles and told to assault. This is all turnover, starting at around December of 2023, the result of a constant, without an operational pause for replenishment and preparation of a positional offensive. Let's add to this inflated requirement for traumatization after wounds and injuries as a basis for demobilization, saying that you have to have really bad injuries in order to be demobilized. Requiring to lose not just one finger, but two on one hand, meaning that if you're out in the field and a grenade hits you and you lose a finger, that's okay, that's one finger gone. That's not enough. You need to lose two fingers if you're going to be demobilized and, given the opportunity. You could still continue to fight, given the opportunity to demobilize. And so on. As a result, there are crowds of cripples in the recruitment, from which individual commanders scoop up reinforcements for assaults. The cripple pool for assaults is not a good thing to hear when you're fighting a war. As stories from the internet show, and the fact that they tend to discharge the slightly wounded early is even more widely known. All this is the very reverse side of the adopted grinding strategy and constant, without proper pauses, pressure on all fronts. The grinding is mutual. And the Kohols, this is a slur for Ukrainians, are striving to improve the personnel exchange rate for themselves to at least 1-to-1. Hence the bet on a million drones, on the speed of artillery response, on the F-16s and existing aircrafts of the Kab. All these are bells, and the VKS motorized regiment generally rings the alarm bell that either there will be a truce or a second wave of mobilization. The adopted strategy of relying on striking with poorly trained infantrymen instead of increasing firepower by adding its million drones to hundreds of artillery barrels makes a second wave almost inevitable. Now, I know I'm bombarding you with a lot of messages here, and there's a lot to take from that, but there's still one more message I want to read to you guys to really try to drive the point home. This is from a Russian propagandist. This is somebody who is solidly in Russia's corner and wants nothing more but for them to win the war. He, in this post, talks about the situation at the front, and it talks about, again, like we've heard in both posts that we just reacted to, about the acute lack of infantry, something you need in order to maintain offensive potential if you want to take cities like Pokrovsk, a city of 60,000. That's going to take a lot of infantry to take, especially if Russia doesn't improve any of its assault tactics. Let's read a little bit from this propagandist about this shortage. Number 1, objective data. The enemy has many Spanish speakers, French Foreign Legion, at least on the sections of the Crimea-Kupiansk front in the Zaporizhia direction. And when they say French Foreign Legion, I don't know if he means in service with the French Foreign Legion, but not in service with the French Foreign Legion. Maybe former French Foreign Legion, I don't know. Foreigners mainly perform the role of intelligence and special forces. In the trenches of the first line are hohols, again, slur for Ukrainians, territorial defense. In the second line, foreigners. This is not true. I mean, I don't know what to tell you, but I can just say that this is not true. There's just simply not enough foreigners for them to do this everywhere. Maybe it could possibly be true in an isolated area, but like it's just not possible to be true. They don't have enough foreigners. They guide infantry, direct artillery, and carry out raids. They get punched in the teeth a couple of times. There are trophies, combat logs in Spanish, documents of the Foreign Legion. There are objective traces of the presence of foreigners. Yes, the second line, special tasks, but they are present. Among the Hispanics, there are many Colombians from the infantry PMCs. There are Colombians in Ukraine, yes. They have been fighting for a long time. There are many of them. Ideologically, they transfer their fight against the revolutionaries here to the Bolsheviks. Traces of the French Foreign Legion practically all over the forehead. More on the Donetsk-Kharkiv directions. On the Dnieper and their presence, they were heard. Fact. There are fewer Poles compared to the end of the last year and the beginning of this year. The Poles make up actually the largest contingent of foreign fighters in the country. Moreover, most were police special forces. Okay. Number 2. F-16s have already been given to the enemy, but so far they are not based in Ukraine. Etc., etc., F-16s. He talks about the fear of ATACMS. And how they're trying to knock out Russian air defense, which is a big risk for them because they needed to defend their factories and all of their places like in Crimea. Number 3. Now, this is the stuff that is important to the topic we're discussing. The pace of our progress has slowed. Slowly, we are crawling west from Donetsk. Toad jumps. It's clear why there's a slowdown. There are no people, and the level of losses are high. For those who don't understand, there is no one physically to advance. The living force has been depleted. All this taking into account the fact that some military leaders are trying to adjust the results to fit the required dates. Everyone understands that by the end of the year, there is a possibility that an agreement will begin. They are trying to make it in time. In Kharkiv, we are fighting back with heavy losses. Lipsy and Volchansk. We are crawling along the Savtova, Kupiansk, and the other day, we took Pashanyi. I'm sorry I pronounced it wrong, but that's in the Donetsk region. Or I believe it's like north of Donetsk. It's like maybe southern Kharkiv. I forget exactly. Zaporizhia and Dnieper are standing. Number 4. The level of the number of tactical commanders is extremely low. During an operation, these father commanders do not prepare an evacuation group. Company storm logic. Why? The lightly wounded will come out on their own, but we don't pull out the heavy ones. The reality is that the commanders do not know their personnel, which is rapidly changing due to high losses. Number 5. Evil tongues say there is one of the static areas the management made a brilliant decision not to take away the 200 dead because this increases the loss statistics. In the meantime, they lie, quote unquote, ownerless, listed as alive or missing. We hear a lot of reports back in Russia of wives and mothers who know nothing of their son's condition as they're continuing to be reported missing. That also happens sometimes in Ukraine too. I've heard those reports as well. Not saying that that's part of this plot. I'm just saying that that is a fact. They are allowed to pull the dead out in parts, in doses, so that the statistics do not increase. Unfortunately, not fiction, but reality. The Russians are under the assumption that depending on the electoral outcomes come November, with Trump possibly being reelected, and then you have Vice President J.D. Vance, or depending on how Ukraine feels comes the end of this year, that negotiations might be around the corner. And if negotiations are right around the corner, then the Russians want to do what they did back in 2014, back in 2015, every time negotiations were coming up, or even through negotiations, as they did violate multiple ceasefires to continue to add pressure. And that is to add as much physical pressure as possible on the front to try to negotiate the best deal out of it. If the Russians want to take the rest of Donetsk and they want to make that a precondition for negotiations, then the further they march forward, the easier it's going to be to convince somebody like Donald Trump, or to convince somebody at the negotiating table that it's not as difficult for Ukraine to give up these cities, to give up Kramatorsk. If they've already taken somewhere like Toretsk, if they've already taken somewhere, that's strategically important, if they're already on the way there, then might as well give them the rest. Or just being used as general pressure to ask for any other demand in negotiations. Point is, they want to take as much as they can before the cannon stop firing. So pressure now in the summer into the winter before the line freezes and negotiations might set in through the winter if Trump wins, or depending on the situation politically, or depending on how much power either side has to continue fighting. Now, on the dangerous side for the Russians, though, is that if they are cannibalizing all these people with experience in the Air Force, or are these artillerymen, or these mortar crews, and they're snipers, in order to try to keep the pressure under the assumption that negotiations would come in winter, but then negotiations do not come because the Russians make a demand like give us Kramatorsk that the Ukrainians are not willing to give, that a Biden administration, that a Kamala Harris administration, or even possibly a Trump administration, depending on how outrageous the claims are, the demands are, or depending on how Trump feels or how the media is, or how the media is reacting to him, then that means the war could continue. And then after all this cannibalization, come January 20th, when you have the next president of the United States, whether it's Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, the war could keep going. And if the United States is still consistent in aid, and it doesn't end with all the chips falling and the United States stopping their support to Ukraine because Trump wanted to make a deal, Ukraine didn't play ball and they pulled out, then that means sustained Western aid from the United States and Europe. That means mobilization from Ukraine, probably kicking into the effect this November and this December. It means that the Ukrainians would have that political uncertainty resolved, and they would have some more confidence in continuing to fight. And then the Russians would be facing going into 2025 with an ongoing artillery crisis when it comes to needing artillery gun barrels and new artillery guns, a tank crisis, a armored vehicle, like armored infantry crisis, and a manpower crisis, which is going to only continue to get worse when it comes to not only finding the recruits, but also paying the ones that they do find ever increasing amounts to convince them to go into a country where the coffin's still coming out of, or the coffins are still coming out of, if the local commanders are brave enough to pick up the bodies. So depending on how this goes, if there's negotiations right around the corner, or if there's not negotiations around the corner, and depending on the sustainability of U.S. aid and how the Ukrainians engage with mobilization and how the Ukrainians are feeling about continuing to fight going into 2025, then you could face a position where the Russians are not only going to have to deal with less infantry assaults, less armored assaults due to not having the vehicles, or more Sovietization of the vehicles that they're putting out there and having older and older vehicles, but also having to either deal with a manpower shortage at a breaking point, or a second wave of mobilization, which is potentially extremely unpopular and likely to be extremely unpopular, and is the one time Putin really took a hit in the popularity. The Russians face a difficult choice when it comes to continuing the pressure, but it's all clear to everyone that they're continuing the pressure now, despite the cost of manpower. Whether that pays off for them with negotiations or that leads to negative consequences down the line, we can't say now, but the opportunities do present themselves. Okay, that's enough of that story. Let's move on to the next one.